On the crowded streets of New York City, in smoke-filled clubs and cramped rehearsal spaces, a sound was brewing, raw, urgent, and unmistakably alive. This was East Coast jazz. It wasn't polished like its West Coast cousin. It was visceral, born from struggle, raised on rhythm, fueled by passion. From bebop to hard bop, the East Coast scene defined a generation of jazz that crackled with intensity. Today, we explore the movement, the musicians, and the message of East Coast jazz, a sound that still pulses through the heart of American music. To understand East Coast jazz, we have to begin with its big bang, bebop. Born in the early 1940s, not in concert halls or conservatories, but in after-hours jam sessions, hotel lounges, and Harlem clubs like Minton's Playhouse and Monroe's Uptown House. At the heart of bebop was a radical idea: freedom. Freedom from the tightly arranged swing charts of the big band era, freedom from predictability. Bebop was small group music, personal, intimate, and explosive. Its founding voices were young, hungry, and determined to push the boundaries. Charlie Parker on alto sax, Dizzy Gillespie on trumpet, Thelonious Monk on piano, Kenny Clark and Max Roach on drums. They were all innovators, each one reshaping the language of jazz through complex chord changes, fast tempos, and unprecedented improvisation. But where did the term bebop come from? It wasn't born in a music theory book. The name came from the imitative scat syllables used by singers and players in improvised solos. Phrases like rebop or bebop mimicked the rhythmic lilt of the music itself. Some historians credit trumpeter Dizzy Gillespie with popularizing the term. Others say it was a journalist's shorthand to capture a sound that felt foreign, even chaotic, to mainstream ears. To traditionalists, bebop was disorienting. It wasn't music to dance to, it was music to think to, or to get lost in. Melodies were jagged, solos stretched out, and harmony moved at lightning speed. Many early critics dismissed it as noise. One 1940s reviewer famously called it anti-jazz. But for young black intellectuals, bohemians, and underground music fans, bebop was liberation. It was art music. It spoke to a post-war generation navigating change, displacement, and the search for identity. It gave musicians power, not just as entertainers, but as composers, thinkers, and cultural revolutionaries. The first people who loved bebop weren't mainstream radio listeners. They were poets, painters, college students, and night owls who craved something new. Bebop became a code, a badge, a language. You either got it or you didn't. In smoky Harlem clubs, under dim blue lights, the future of jazz was taking shape. Not everyone understood it, but no one could ignore it. Bebop didn't ask for approval, it demanded attention. By the early 1950s, bebop had cracked jazz wide open, but something new was emerging on the East Coast. A sound that was earthier, more soulful, and grounded in blues, gospel, and street energy. This was hard bop, and it became the heartbeat of East Coast jazz. Hard bop wasn't a rejection of bebop's complexity, it was a redirection, a move toward music that was still harmonically adventurous, but more rooted in emotional and cultural experience. The grooves were deeper, the melodies more singable, and the rhythm sections, they could swing and stomp at the same time. At the center of this movement was Blue Note Records, the legendary label founded in 1939 by German immigrants Alfred Lion and Francis Wolff. By the 1950s, Blue Note had become the cultural engine of East Coast jazz. With a singular focus on artistic integrity and high production values, Blue Note gave musicians the time and space to create on their terms. They didn't just record the sound of hard bop, they curated it. Much of that sonic signature came from Rudy Van Gelder, the meticulous engineer whose home-turned studio in Hackensack, New Jersey, and later in Inglewood Cliffs, captured performances with stunning clarity. The Van Gelder sound was warm, intimate, and crisp, preserving the rawness of a live session while giving it studio polish. Iconic albums like Moanin' by Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers, Song for My Father by Horace Silver, The Sidewinder by Lee Morgan, and Speak No Evil by Wayne Shorter were all released on Blue Note and defined not only the hard bop genre, but the visual and cultural language of jazz itself. Francis Wolff's black and white photography and Reed Miles's bold, modernist graphic design gave Blue Note albums a signature look, clean, confident, and unmistakably cool. Blue Note was more than a record label, it was a home. A space where East Coast musicians weren't just players, they were storytellers, documenting life in post-war America through melody, rhythm, and improvisation. In many ways, to hear a Blue Note record from the 1950s or 60s is to hear the very soul of East Coast jazz. East Coast jazz was more than a sound, it was geography. And at its epicenter stood New York City, the city that never sleeps and never stopped swinging. On 52nd Street, jazz spilled out of club doors and onto the pavement. They called it Swing Street, and for good reason. Clubs like Birdland, the Village Vanguard, and the Five Spot weren't just venues, they were incubators. They nurtured new ideas, new lineups, and legendary moments. The Vanguard alone became a rite of passage. If you could hold the room there, narrow, intimate, honest, you could hold any room in the world. New York was chaotic and electrifying. Musicians lived fast, rehearsed late, and jammed even later. In walk-up apartments and crowded studios, horn players and rhythm sections pushed boundaries, innovated in real time. There was no separation between life and music. It was all jazz. But the East Coast wasn't just New York. Head northeast and you'd find Boston, another jazz stronghold. Quieter, maybe, but no less impactful. While it didn't boast the same density of clubs, Boston had something else: education and experimentation. At the Berklee College of Music, one of the first schools to treat jazz as a serious art form, young musicians came to study harmony, improvisation, and the mechanics of the music. Berklee was a laboratory where theory met instinct, attracting talent from across the globe. Boston's jazz workshop, Paul's Mall, and Wally's Cafe, one of the oldest continuously operating jazz clubs in the U.S., provided stages for both legends and up-and-comers. And thanks to its vibrant student population, Boston became a testing ground for new sounds, new ensembles, and new directions in modern jazz. Together, New York and Boston formed a corridor of creativity, a jazz highway where tradition and rebellion traveled side by side. While New York gave jazz its edge, Boston gave it structure and space to evolve. The two cities fed each other, their contrasts creating balance, their similarities building community. East Coast jazz thrived in this ecosystem, restless, rooted, and reaching always for something new. East Coast jazz wasn't just a sound, it was a constellation of voices. Voices that redefined what jazz could express. And at its center were the titans, each one a giant, each one a stylistic universe unto himself. Miles Davis was a shapeshifter. Though often associated with cool jazz and his later electric innovations, Miles honed his craft on the East Coast. In the 1950s, his first great quintet, with John Coltrane, Red Garland, Paul Chambers, and Philly Joe Jones, produced some of the most elegant and emotionally complex small group jazz ever recorded. Albums like Roundabout Midnight and Milestones showcased a lyrical, introspective style with cutting-edge harmonies and rhythms. Miles didn't shout, he whispered, and the world listened. John Coltrane began as a sideman, but soon became a force all his own. After his transformative stint with Miles, Coltrane's solo career launched into spiritual and sonic territory no one had dared before. Giant Steps was a technical marvel. My Favorite Things reimagined a show tune into a hypnotic modal odyssey, and A Love Supreme. That was not just a jazz album, it was a prayer, a declaration of faith, and a sonic blueprint for transcendence. Then there was Thelonious Monk, jazz's mad genius and architect of the unexpected. With his dissonant chords, percussive attack, and angular melodies, Monk sounded like no one else. His compositions, like Straight, No Chaser, Round Midnight, and Blue Monk, are now standards, yet they remain gloriously strange. At the Five Spot Cafe, Monk's house band became the epicenter of innovation. His music wasn't just played, it was studied, puzzled over, revered. Sonny Rollins, the saxophone colossus, brought a streetwise power and a probing intellect to every solo. Known for practicing on the Williamsburg Bridge, Rollins used New York as his rehearsal room, his muse. His album Saxophone Colossus remains a landmark in jazz history, and his improvisations dance between blues, calypso, and hard bop with fearless joy. Rollins didn't just play music, he explored it in real time. And then there was Charles Mingus, bassist, composer, firebrand. A man who bridged Duke Ellington's sophistication with the rawness of protest jazz. Mingus's compositions like Haitian Fight Song and Fables of Faubus were powerful, orchestral, emotionally volatile. His music raged, wept, and shouted truth. He demanded greatness from his bandmates and himself, often to the point of conflict, but always in pursuit of something greater. Each of these titans expanded jazz's vocabulary. They weren't just players, they were philosophers, revolutionaries, architects of sound. Together, they defined East Coast jazz, not as a single sound, but as a restless, ever-evolving dialogue between tradition and transformation. This wasn't jazz for background music. This was jazz for the soul, the mind, the streets, and the future. East Coast jazz was fast, intricate, and unapologetically intense. Rhythm sections didn't just keep time. They propelled the music like a runaway train. The drums cracked, the bass thumped, and the piano comps jabbed and danced, creating a charged, kinetic foundation. Improvised solos weren't just showcases of technical skill, they were confessions, declarations, sermons. Musicians told stories in bursts of notes, sharp turns, and unexpected phrasing. This was bebop's beating heart, complex, angular, and daringly abstract, but always rooted in the raw emotion of the blues. Compared to the laid-back, arranged nature of West Coast jazz, the East Coast sound burned hot. It was restless, gritty, and urban, reflecting the intensity of New York itself. This wasn't just music, it was testimony, a statement of identity. Each phrase was a punch, a prayer, a shout for recognition. Jazz on the East Coast wasn't just an art form, it was a battleground. For many artists, the music was inseparable from the moment. Mid-century America was wrestling with civil rights, segregation, and Cold War paranoia. Jazz, with its roots in Black expression and its embrace of individual freedom, became both a beacon and a threat. With drug use not uncommon among musicians in general, jazz musicians were easily targeted. Charles Mingus, ever the firebrand, found himself clashing not only with club owners and critics, but also with law enforcement. His compositions weren't just daring, they were provocative and sometimes openly defiant. Fables of Faubus, his biting satire of Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus, was so politically charged that Columbia Records refused to release the vocal version. Mingus, never one to be silenced, simply took it to another label. He was frequently harassed for his outbursts on and off the bandstand. His 1960s concerts were sometimes disrupted by the police, and his refusal to play by the industry's rules, musically or behaviorally, made him a target. But he was far from alone. Max Roach, one of the architects of hard bop, released We Insist, Freedom. Now Sweet in 1960, a bold, confrontational jazz suite demanding civil rights and dignity for African Americans. With Abby Lincoln's searing vocals and themes drawn from African liberation movements, the album drew backlash, but also inspired a generation of activist musicians. Billie Holiday had already felt the cost of singing truth. Her haunting performance of Strange Fruit, a protest against lynching, led to FBI scrutiny, harassment, and eventually a targeted narcotics arrest orchestrated by federal agents. She was denied a cabaret card in New York City, effectively silencing her in her hometown. On the East Coast, these weren't isolated incidents. Jazz musicians, especially black musicians, lived under constant surveillance. Clubs were monitored, lyrics were dissected, and yet the music never stopped. In fact, it got bolder. Jazz was no longer just about improvisation. It became an act of resistance. The music spoke when others couldn't. It challenged power, demanded change, and bore witness to injustice. East Coast jazz carried the weight of this legacy of pushing boundaries not only in harmony and rhythm, but in truth. It asked, what happens when an artist refuses to stay silent? And then it answered, with a horn, a rhythm, and a voice that still echoes today. East Coast jazz was never static. It evolved, absorbing, reacting, and reflecting every cultural shift that followed its birth. And its legacy? It's written not only in the past, but in the voices of the artists who push the sound into the future. Take Chick Corea. Born in Chelsea, Massachusetts, Corea grew up surrounded by classical and jazz traditions. A product of the East Coast's rigorous musical culture, Berkeley, jam sessions, conservatories, he carried the spirit of hard bop into uncharted territory. With Return to Forever, Corea fused jazz with Latin, funk, and electronic sounds. Yet his phrasing and melodic sensibility were still rooted in that East Coast interplay, precision wrapped in passion. Even at his most experimental, his approach was unmistakably informed by the harmonic intensity of the East Coast school. Pat Metheny, though from Missouri, made his mark while studying and teaching at Berklee College of Music in Boston. His early collaborations with Gary Burton and later solo work revealed a deep connection to East Coast intellectualism, structured, technically brilliant, yet emotionally expansive. His guitar tone became synonymous with jazz fusion's lyricism, but behind it lay a commitment to jazz's core tenets: improvisation, complexity, and storytelling. Metheny's music moved geographically, but philosophically, it was always informed by the East. David Sanborn, raised in St. Louis but developed in New York's fast-moving session scene, embodied the East Coast's embrace of jazz and pop cross-pollination. His saxophone style was fiery, blues-inflected, and unmistakably urban, reflecting the tension and momentum of the city. While critics debated whether Sanborn was jazz, funk, or smooth jazz, the truth was simpler: he was New York. The grit in his playing echoed the subway roar and the high-stakes energy of post-bop tradition. And Freddie Hubbard, the trumpet virtuoso from Indianapolis, was shaped on East Coast stages. After moving to New York, Hubbard recorded with Art Blakey, Herbie Hancock, and Wayne Shorter, becoming a bridge between hard bop and post-bop innovation. His blistering tone, harmonic bravery, and swagger captured the fire of East Coast jazz while pointing beyond it. With albums like Red Clay and First Light, Hubbard expanded the trumpet's role, creating music that was as physical as it was cerebral. Together, these artists remind us that East Coast jazz wasn't a museum piece. It was a launching pad. Today, the energy lives on. From Brooklyn jam sessions to Boston conservatories, from modern fusion collectives to digital jazz collaborations, the East Coast continues to be a jazz laboratory, bold, boundary-pushing, and deeply connected to its roots. And in the playing of artists like Esperanza Spalding, Melissa Aldana, and Christian McBride, we hear echoes of that lineage. The structures change, the tools evolve, but the spirit, that remains the same: restless, refined, and resolutely expressive. East Coast jazz is more than a genre. It's a spirit, alive in every syncopation, every solo, every subway echo. It's the sound of the city, the rhythm of resilience, a legacy that endures, note by note, beat by beat.